And welcome back to John for the second time today. I have the honor of introducing one of the people that don't need any introduction, probably, but in case you've missed the essential information, we have now the author of the Self-Worth Safari and the founder of the Self-Worth Academy, whose associates, including me, have organized this first Self-Worth Week. John has had a long career as a professional coach and speaker, and over the last few years, he has kind of transitioned or reoriented his approach towards self-worth. And on a more personal note, during the early steps of writing the book, when he came to Sicily, he discovered granita, the Sicilian wonderful foodie thing that I invite you all to taste one day. And I like to think that that sparked a lot of conversations that led to some of the beautiful insights and inspirations in the book. Today, John is going to talk about one of the applications we mentioned before. So one of the contexts in which self-worth is particularly useful, which is relations. And stay tuned, because at the end, there will be also a very useful resource that is going to share with us. Just one more thing, when we were preparing a little bit this session, John told me he likes to be interrupted, which means that during there probably won't be any breakout rooms, but you're free to, of course, write in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to intervene. And I now leave the stage to John.
Well, thank you, Claudia. Yes, it's true to say that any words written about pleasure in the Self-Worth Safari have been written with granita in mind. That was a very influential trip, and certainly a lot of what subsequently took shape from the conversations that we had in Sicily in the spring or early summer, perhaps, of 2017. I, for one, am so looking forward to more conversations like that when our experience of lockdown is over. Much as I appreciate this platform and all it's enabled for the last year and more. But I am sure as heck looking forward to the real life relationship build that happens when we can meet each other in 3 dimensions rather than just in 2, and not to mention savoring the delights of local delicacies around Europe, to which I will be devoting a lot of my time just as soon as borders and regulations and vaccines allow. I doubt if there's anybody here who doesn't know the backstory. I will share some slides in a moment, but for me, self-worth has been a relatively new discovery. I still have to remind myself that I'm only 4 years into that story. It's only been 2 years since the book was published and since Self-Worth Academy started. And on this day, the 11th of February 2017, I still had no idea of the adventure ahead. So for anyone who might be feeling stuck at the moment, let me just underline that, because we never know what lies around the corner. We never know who we're going to meet or what experience we're going to have, or what need we will come across in our explorations. That will be the start of a whole new chapter. And I'd like to think that's still true. I was listening to Kerry's session this morning on viewing a career as an adventure. And I thought, I'd like to think that is still the case. You know, a career can still be an adventure. One of the areas that's definitely, for me, a continuing adventure is the topic of relationships. And it's into that we're going to take, I won't say a deep dive, but we will do a little bit of exploring, shall we say. So there are in the book 6 terrains. The one that interests me most right now, and the one that I'm doing most of my own personal learning in, is in the arena of relationships, in the widest possible sense of that term. The the background behind me, it is a virtual background, but it is of a very real place. It's the fields in which I grew up. I grew up in the west of Ireland, in a very remote part of the west of Ireland. At least remote if you're growing up in it. You know, if you're a kid, your distance is pretty much limited to what you can cycle. So your concept of accessibility is very different to what it is as an adult. As an adult, we can jump in a car, buy a plane ticket, and you know, normally, and go to places. But where I grew up, the nearest kid of my own age, or the nearest boy of my own age, which is a terribly important distinction when you're aged 7, 8, 9, and 10, was probably about 5 to 6 kilometers away. So I grew up in a lot of isolation, and I experienced it as isolation. And that had a very direct effect upon my own thinking about myself. It meant that when I subsequently went to boarding school at the age of 12, that I was pretty ill prepared. I was going to say pretty well ill prepared, but you know what I mean. I was pretty badly prepared for the sudden experience of being with 300 boys of my own age. And the shock of that, and the ways that I quickly learned to role play in that situation probably sowed the seeds for the way that I subsequently created a relationship with myself. And today I have a great respect for the kind of yin yang of the relationship we have with ourselves, but also the relationship that we have with other people. Self-worth does not, in my experience, develop in isolation. It develops by our experience of another, or the absence of another, as the case may be. It's in that interplay of relationships with other people that our own relationship with ourselves is formed. I often think there's even a paradox here, that there is you know, the paradox of self-worth in some ways, in that it often takes another person to kickstart it. It's a bit like a motor that needs to be fired up from the outside. And if you're lucky in life, that significant other is your parents or your caregivers. But to be honest, many of us are not so lucky. And therefore, that reparenting of ourselves that Claudia was talking about becomes so significant. So we are, in many ways, children of our ecosystems. And that might still be true. And for me, I believe it is still true. Where, you know, self-worth does not mean that we become cut off and indifferent to our ecosystem. On the contrary, we're always interacting with it and either learning from that experience, or in many cases, putting up walls to some of that experience. So with that context, let's do a little bit of slide share, just for a few, really. I'm not planning to do too much slide share today, but and I'm not going back over the shifts or going back over Safari. You know what this is about. But just summing up a little bit, you know, let's just remind ourselves what happens when self-worth is low in the context of relationships. So I'm not talking here about our internal resilience. I'm not talking about some of the other domains like health. But, you know, here's a few of the behaviors that might happen when self-worth is low. Any others? What would you add? Feel free to use the chat. One that I see a lot of, for example, is hiding. I don't just mean having your camera off on a Zoom call. I mean the hiding that was spoken about in Monica's session, where people can hide in the workplace and not contribute. And I love the way that Mark, the CEO of that company, was challenging that kind of hiding, because that's a challenge sometimes that can touch upon people's self-worth. What else would you add as a classic behavior in relationships caused by low self-worth?
John, can you see the chat, or would you like me
No, if you can remind me what's on it, because I cannot see the chat.
Yes. So seeking approval, setting boundaries, blaming the other, allowing bullying, constant need to prove oneself, making assumptions. There's a lot of stuff coming up about self and other, play roles, brag about being so good, show off, hating, conforming, ruminating, intimacy, manipulation.
It's a long list, is it not? And that's life, exactly that. And even when self-esteem is high, no, not self-worth, self-esteem, we know the difference. Even when self-esteem is high, we can still get many of the behaviors on that previous list. Personally, I don't regard bullying as one of the, to me, bullying is low self-esteem, not high self-esteem. But that's probably a long conversation. There's an equally, maybe not quite as long list, but there is still quite a decent list of things that can happen even when self-esteem is high. One that I see a lot of in online fora, for example, and it's related to this need to be the center of attention, is when people share stuff in order to drag the bone back into their yard. So, you know, have you read the book by, or have you, that reminds me of the time when, you know, that style of interruption, where people will often use a very peripheral word in a conversation in order to make themselves the center of attention. So even when self-esteem is high, we can get a lot of behaviors like that. Anything that you would add to that list?
Is narcissism high self-esteem or low self-esteem?
Well, we're talking here about the behaviors. So which behavior of narcissism, Andy, would you be thinking of?
Well, the bullying.
Okay.
I thought that was maybe coming from a high self-esteem, but you said it was low.
Well, in general, if somebody needs to bully somebody else, then there's definitely a question mark over their self-esteem. You know, why would they need to? If they genuinely felt self-esteem, why would they need to bully somebody else? It's not impossible they would have an inflated self-esteem. So it is indeed possible. But very often the history of bullying is somebody being bullied themselves. And therefore they in some way need to assert their power in order to feel okay. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to indulge them, of course, but in fact, one of the consequences of high self-worth is the ability to put up boundaries.
And Faye adds this. If self-esteem is high but self-worth is low, you bully. If self-worth is low, you think it is allowable for somebody to bully you, a common problem for many women.
Yes, if self-worth is low, it is quite possible that you will allow somebody to bully you. I don't often come across cases where self-esteem is high but self-worth is low. Sorry, let me back up. In the main, in fact, let me come back to this point later because I want to cover something else first. But in general, you will find that self-esteem can be high, but it's often not rooted in self-worth. It's rooted in an attempt to be validated externally. And if you met me even 10 years ago, then you would come across somebody who had reasonable self-esteem. But here was the problem. The problem with self-esteem is that it fluctuates. So I was very much, I identified very much with my client. At least one relationship where my preoccupation with my own plans was detrimental to that relationship. Because what my partner saw is somebody who was very preoccupied with the future that he was envisaging in his head. And she didn't necessarily believe that included her. At least there was every evidence that I was thinking about my business or whatever, rather than necessarily thinking about the relationship. So this self-preoccupation can have very real consequences in relationships. And I know of many women today who complain of the inattention of guys, not because the guys are, being unfaithful or whatever, but are just self-preoccupied with whatever's going on in their own minds. You would also come across somebody who was constantly anticipating what might go wrong. Probably part of the survivor mentality that I'd adopted to get through boarding school between the ages of 12 and 17. I developed this ability to anticipate what might go wrong and try and make sure I wasn't in those situations. Definitely bouts of workaholism, sometimes very prolonged bouts of workaholism, driven by a need for self-validation. It wasn't so much validation of others. That was an earlier stage. During my 20s and 30s, I sought the validation from other people. In my 40s and 50s, I needed validation for myself. And that reputation with self became a very dominant mode in my life. That in turn could make me very reactive if those plans were being disrupted. And I was absolutely addicted to improvement. I was a self-improvement addict. I read everything I could consume. I constantly berated myself for what I wasn't doing. I smiled in identification at Kerry's list this morning, where she had about 10 tips for imposter syndrome. No, it was 15, wasn't it? 15 tips for imposter syndrome. And I was the guy who would want to implement all 15 of them before I would feel okay. And I had a moment of humor around that. But so for me, personal growth in relationships was, the discovery of self-worth, as I've already described in the book, was a pretty important landmark in all of this. The whole idea that I could be okay with myself without conditions was probably the most radical, revolutionary insight of a lifetime. And that does, however, doesn't mean the growth stops. And here I want to talk a little bit about what has happened since the publication of the book, and particularly in relationships. And I know I'm not alone in some of this, because I've had some conversations indeed with some of you and with other people that can reveal that once you actually discover a measure of self-worth, it can, in its own way, produce loneliness as a bit of a byproduct. Now, that might be a contradiction, because you have this loyal friendship with yourself. Yes, you do. But you also very quickly begin to discover just how much of other people's behavior is driven by self-validation. And that can produce a very strange experience of being of everyone being in their own bubble sometimes. And nowhere is that more true than in some personal development settings, where you can be sitting in a circle and very quickly you become to realize that everyone is sharing for performance. And that even when there's emotions being shared, sometimes it's, the tears are running out of one eye and the other eye is actually watching what the effect is. And of course, we see the same behavior in social media sometimes. So the ongoing experience of self-worth isn't without challenge. This is not like a happy ever after story that someone discovers. I'll share my own experience, that I discovered self-worth and then all the learning stopped and I just bask in the glory ever since. Far from it. And nowhere is that more true than in the realm of relationships. And the most recent experience of that, of course, for me has been during the pandemic. So on the one hand, the experience of self-worth has been so valuable, because having the deep roots of friendship inside means that even in a pandemic situation, I'm not particularly affected by lockdowns. Not particularly. However, what has been very difficult for me is the sense of disconnection, because I came across to the UK for the first lockdown in spring of last year to be with my daughter, etc., and then came back in the autumn for her wedding. In fact, although it was a much smaller wedding than she had originally foreseen because of the current restrictions in place at the time, and dawdled a bit in the comfort of family and friends, etc., only to discover that there was a new lockdown coming up over the hill, which means I've not been back home since September, and this is February. And that does at times produce a sense of disconnection. Not of loneliness today, because while I have had that experience along the way, it's not my current experience, but there is a sense of being disconnected and a real question about where home is at this point, because I have my home of origin, if you like, in Ireland, where I still have brothers. I have also got brothers in the USA. Plus, I am sitting here in the UK with my kids, and all my stuff is sitting in Lisbon, which is, several hundred kilometers away. So there is still an ongoing challenge, even in a pandemic. What are yours? We'll go to the 5 ways, etc. in a moment, time check, but any current challenges that you would like to share? Feel free to use the chat. Specifically relationship related. Now, we're not trying to cover the other terrains in this session. We're talking relationships.
John, can I?
Sure, please do, Monica.
I just wrote it in the chat. Thank you for the loneliness experience, because of I experience it as well. It's like wearing brand new sharp glasses, and there is no way back. And it's only, for me, it's only way to be much more in compassion with myself and with others.
Yeah, precisely my experience. There is no way back. You can, once you see this self-worth, self-esteem distinction, you cannot unsee it again. There's no undo, there's no control Z. And initially, of course, that's thrilling, as it was for me. I described the new joy and the new freedom of that in the book. But I can also tell you that since the publication of the book, it has also produced its own share of loneliness, because you see the sheer amount of stuff that's happening that is self-esteem driven, particularly social media, of course, but even in more personal relationships. And that is quite breathtaking sometimes when you see it. However, there are any other comments there, Claudia, or may we move on?
Comments in the chat. Okay, so somebody says, not feeling part of my workplace. Living alone, sometimes a lonely place. Disconnection, that's a good way of putting it. Family in one country, job in another, living alone with a dog.
Yep.
Speaking about mental health challenges to healthy people.
Yeah.
Then a current challenge is finding where self-worth takes place in a new relationship. And somebody commented to Laura, so true, lack of spontaneous stimulation. If something happens, it's because I did it, but no surprises. And
Yeah.
Sonia, I was doing okay with this COVID situation, but this is taking much longer than I expected. I now know I pushed away reality for a while, but that I will need to explore new ways to stay in contact with family and friends.
Indeed. I will just, I obviously cannot, because of time, respond to all of those, but I'll just pick on one comment made about loneliness and isolation, because it is such a hot topic at the moment. And it is one I could talk about quite a lot, actually, so please don't let me, because I have experience to share of that. And I would simply say that there isn't any one experience of loneliness, just as there's no one experience of grief. And that we intuitively know that sometimes, even in the loneliness, because it's the uniqueness of it that feels so painful, just as is true of grief. So if you are going through that, and in particular, if you've tried to break out of it with friends, and even more, particularly if you've tried to break out of it, out of it with people that you perceive to be mentally healthy, or even gurus, and that didn't work, that can really produce. In fact, I had a story about that in the book, and my editor took it out. She said it was likely to be counterproductive to publish it. But I did have, at least on 2 occasions during 2016, during the difficult times, I reached out to people who did not turn out to be the people I thought they were. And of course, that even intensified the experience of aloneness and not okayness that I was experiencing. So it's a big topic, is loneliness. Now, one of the, we're going to go into specific situations in a moment, but there's 5 kind of general ways that self-worth really does transform relationships. The first is pretty obvious, I think. It's been covered in the book as well. We become interested in other people. Lindsay illustrated that so well today in her talk. And as a result of becoming interested in other people, we now are in charge of the spotlight, to use her metaphor, not mine, hers. In other words, instead of being the victim of the spotlight, we actually are now holding the spotlight. We decide where to shine it. And occasionally that might well be back on ourselves, but at least you're now holding the spotlight with self-worth. And that ability to be interested in other people is really transformative. The second benefit, and we saw it so beautifully illustrated in the session Monica did with her client, is it when people have self-worth, they can start to focus on a common purpose. We're going to hear more about this on Saturday when Tracy Fenton speaks. It's very hard for people to have common purpose when they're all trying to prove themselves, because proving yourself is a selfish agenda. So if you're in a team of 5 people and everyone is trying to prove themselves, that's like exactly the opposite to common purpose. There might be occasional alignment, but it will be temporary. And you can never quite trust how long it's going to last. So one of the great benefits, and this is also true in personal relationships, is that where both partners have a sense of self-worth, it allows us to have common purpose. And it's really hard to have common purpose without that. As a result of that, when you know that you are dealing with someone else who is interested in you, not just trying to be interesting, when you and they together have common purpose, we then have the basis for trust. We might like other people, but if they don't share our purposes or they betray very little interest in us, the trust is not going to develop for long. We might want to develop trust with that person, but that might not be possible. And that can be painful, particularly, of course, in a romantic setting, but also in a business setting. One of my favorites is simply more energy. The amount of energy that goes into proving ourselves is enormous. The amount of energy that goes into checking, can I really trust that other person, is enormous. The amount of management time that goes into checking and controlling, and again, Tracy is very eloquent on this in her, moving away from control and more towards a culture of freedom. So more on that on Saturday. But one of the immediate benefits is, of course, it saves all the energy that has to go into teams and into relationships, checking, A, am I okay? B, are they still behaving towards me in the way that I expect them to? That's mistrust. So as a consequence, all the energy that used to go into all of those efforts can now go into more fun and creative activities, which gives us the 5th benefit, which is more joy, more freedom, and a lot less anxiety. Now, sometimes there is residual anxiety that comes from earlier days and that has a longer history. So I said less anxiety as opposed to no anxiety. I'm well aware that self-worth isn't the single panacea for anxiety. It's a wonderful quality. That doesn't mean it solves every problem in the world. Let's now take these, however, and start looking at different contexts. How's the time going? Good, we get about 5 minutes each. So the first context I'm going to take is a work one, where someone is leading a team. And again, feel free to get involved in this and just unmute yourself if you want to chip in. If the leader is self-esteem based, then this is probably, not necessarily, but it's probably the sorts of behaviors you'll get. You will get, and I would say most models of leadership run to this at the moment. So CEO comes in and says, what I want from you guys is, and we are to be the best. That's how we define ourselves. Indeed, entire companies define themselves by being the best. And there will be very clear accountability to one person who is the boss. And you can bet your bottom dollar it will be accompanied by some control-based metrics or KPIs that may well be measuring you by the hour in some organizations. If, on the other hand, we get self-worth-based behavior, then notice how the I starts to become a we. It becomes what we want to achieve. We start co-creating agendas and objectives together, which we really do at Self-Worth Academy. I can say that, I think, without fear of contradiction. We define what we are going to do. The focus is less upon being the best and more about why our work is important. In other words, it's about the context in which we are valuable rather than whether we're bigger or have more offices than somebody else. And the accountability is to each other. And this is a fascinating development which happens when people have self-worth, is that the accountability is no longer to one person. Which, by the way, means you get a much deeper level of engagement. And at the end of the day, it's freedom-based rather than control-based. And, excuse me, in our work with leaders, in our work looking at the future, and again, I'll speak more about that in our closing session on Saturday after Tracy Fenton. But we see that just the 4 shifts outlined here could transform a lot of workplaces for the better, not only for the humans who work in them, but actually also for their ability to produce value and their ability to reinvent themselves in the challenging times that we live in. From your perspective, from your experience, in what other ways can self-worth enhance the ability to lead a team? Or conversely, what problems would you like to see discussed from a self-worth perspective when it comes to leading a team?
I can see 2 things, John. One is we went into that quite a bit yesterday. Curiosity, what's going on? With Monica's client, you know, instead of taking a 15-minute plant walkthrough, he took a 45-minute plant walkthrough. And those weak signals that he picked up helped him to be more efficient and deliver much better service and have a better workplace. And the other one is, we've mentioned this before, but being able to say, you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then you appeal to the collective intelligence of the team, which values the team, it values what they've got to offer, and it values the connections between the people on the team who then work together to make that piece of information more useful.
Thank you, Beth. Great example.
I'd like to add one in on the self-worth, which is that I think it helps you to be much more, it helps the team much more easily to change direction when something isn't working right. That's the thing we really see.
Yeah.
So because nobody's so invested with their self-esteem in a solution, you're just trying to solve something to make something work. And I think if you can bring that, then you really are applying self-worth.
Yep, very true. It allows problems to be discussed as problems much earlier on, rather than hiding the problem because it's not politically okay to talk about it.
It also makes it possible for problems to become possibilities.
Thank you.
Promise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I? Can I?
Sure. Is that Monica?
Yeah, it's me. I think to be brave and courage. It brings a lot of courage, a lot of braveness, and just to try things to do the new way. So it brings innovation and creativity. So it's just, and as we spoke with Marek, fantastic productivity. It's really incredible how could culture based on self-worth be productive.
Mm-hmm.
It's just amazing, really.
Yeah.
It's
Brilliant.
magic.
Please keep the contributions going in the chat. I'm going to have to move on to another context in a moment. And again, the chat will create some very good collective intelligence at the end of this, so you may want to save it. So that's just a flavor, if you like, of what we want to do in leadership. We want to enable that productivity, enable that creativity by creating environments and by equipping leaders to be aware of self-worth, and not only to be aware of it, but to actually work with their people to enhance self-worth as well. Tracy will go even further. She will say you shouldn't even hire anybody who hasn't got self-worth because the amount of time you're going to spend managing them, the cost of that is going to be crippling. More on that on Saturday. Let's now look at personal relationships. Let's again listen to language. Let's look at intent. Let's look at how this plays out. Again, no shortage of self-esteem based relationships out there. In fact, sometimes, and this is my experience of loneliness coming into it, I begin to wonder if there's any other kind. You know, the way that people shop for a partner quite overtly. Without being struck down by lightning on the spot. If you look at what has happened in online dating, in which I've had 5 very lonely years until some recent success, smile, that'll get somebody engaged. But if we look at the language that's used, what I want in a partner, the attempt to be interesting, the attempt to prove self and value self and playing the role of, so much so that, you wonder if there's anything that isn't a Hollywood set sometimes in the world of romantic relationships, and what on earth is going on behind. And by the way, it's no surprise we should have that. We've had a rising tide of narcissism and self-preoccupation stretching all the way back to the 1980s. Is it any wonder it's showing up in relationships? Self-worth-based relationships, again, the language starts to change. It's more about the relationship that we want to build together rather than what I want and what you want. It's more about being genuinely present to the other person. And it's about a mutual I'm okay, you're okay. And to me, that's really important. I also felt it came through in Malek's presentation with Monica the other day, which is a fundamental care and respect for each person, even the non-performers, that they are okay. It's just, you might not be okay with us right now. That doesn't mean you're not okay. I love that part. That's sometimes the way in which we talk about other people, either when they're not present or when they're not a good fit for us, is often a pretty good indication of how we're thinking deep down about them. And above all, what self-worth allows is it allows people to show up exactly as they are. And that's I'm currently very happy to be basking in a bit of that, where I can show up as I am, my new partner can show up as she is, and the freedom of that's just fantastic. It's not it's not that continuous role play and the cost emotionally of that in relationships. Comments, observations on that before we move on? You might have to put them in the chat, folks, because we're running a little bit tight on time, because clearly I lost the plot somewhere along the way. Third context might be between business colleagues, and they might be two different businesses. That's not just, I'm not just thinking employee colleagues here, but they may well be, you know, people that other businesses you're in partnership with. Again, self-esteem based language, not unlike what we've seen with relationships. It's very much about what we do for each other. It's very much about how valuable I am. It's all about the ratings. You know, just look at how TripAdvisor functions. Just look at NPS scoring between businesses. This net promoter scoring that's dominating now. You know, when you get you put the phone down or you end an interaction and the little dialogue pops up with, you know, how would you rate your experience with us today? Well, is that about you or is that about them? Ta-da! Self-preoccupation isn't just a malaise of individuals, it's also a malaise of companies. And above all, this continual conditional trust, because just as there's a condition implicit in all self-esteem, you can bet your bottom dollar there's going to be a condition implicit in trust as well. So yes, you're the trusted partner today, and then suddenly next month you're not. Why? Because some conditions weren't met, often without you even knowing about it. Self-worth based, again, is different. It's about what we're going to do together. It's what's our common purpose here. What are we building rather than just what do we do for each other? What greater reality are we aiming for? The value is not about adjectives. It's about how it is we're valuable rather than how valuable we are. Completely different question. You know, the ratings, the questions at the end of the experience or the workshop or whatever are different questions. They're what was most useful questions rather than how impressive was my performance questions. And we begin to lay the basis for unconditional trust. Now, I know that gets some people going, well, you can never give unconditional trust. Well, not if you're self-esteem based, you can't, for sure. You don't even have it with yourself. If you're self-esteem based, how could you possibly give unconditional trust to anybody else? But if you're self-worth based, you know you're okay in all circumstances. So we can actually start talking about unconditional trust without the control sheets and without the proving of self and all the other costly mechanisms that get put into business relationships in order to prove that we're still working for each other. Now, mindful of time, so I'm going to sum up fairly quickly. Again, this diagram is in the book, so many of you will have seen it already. Up here we have the performer. So here's the space in which self-worth is high, but there is still an orientation to self. That can happen. So it happens in a lot of ego-based. I'm not saying their self-worth is low, but here is where you get the performer. Why? Because ultimately their orientation is to themselves and to being even more interesting in being a better performer. No shortage of that around, plenty of it you can find. At its worst, I come back to Andy's comment about narcissism, you actually get narcissism here. I think narcissism is linked with low self-worth rather than high self-worth, personally. That's my experience. And I think the bulk of psychological research will actually support that. Over here, you get a group that I have come across a lot because I used to work in nonprofits as well as in businesses, the phenomenon of the needy helper. And the needy helper are a nightmare to manage. On the surface, they're oriented towards service, and then they are. You know, they genuinely want a better world, but you know, sometimes you cannot even trust them to catch the bus. They are, you know, their motivation is genuinely towards the collective, but behind it there is a neediness, and that neediness, unfortunately, often sabotages their careers and sabotages common effort because they're craving the positive evaluation all the time and they're very, very expensive to manage. You get a lot of them in nonprofits, but actually not only there, you find lots of them in the development and training industries as well. And where we want to find our best people is in this quadrant here, which are people who have high self-worth. They don't have the neediness, but their contribution is still, their orientation is still towards others and the impact they want to have. They don't care so much about the adjectives. You can give them some tough feedback. They can take it. You know, you give a needy helper tough feedback and they have an emotional crisis and they're gone. You really wish you hadn't even started the conversation. But you can give tough feedback to a contributor because there's a common desire to contribute. They will respect you for saying, they may not agree with you, but at least the ability to handle that disagreement is actually in itself a reflection of high self-worth. So obviously, as part of Self-Worth Week, we are very keen to hear from people who are interested in these, whether it's teams, businesses, career transition, etc. We have lots of programs for facilitators and associates, and I would love to hear from you and carry on that conversation whenever you're ready. But what I really want to launch today, and particularly with so many friends present, is something that's brand new, which Claudia will now pop in the chat, and which I'm going to take a very quick moment to share, which I've been learning while doing it over the last while. And whether you have actually, whether you have already read Self-Worth Safari or not, if you have read it, then this little 28-day reflections might be useful recap. If you haven't read it, then it might tempt you to read it. But specifically, the purpose of this resource is to develop self-worth in the context of relationships with other people. So it's not trying to repeat the book, but it's trying to go into a little bit of detail on what it's like to develop self-worth with other people. And it's a day by day, it's 1 page a day. So it's in the time-honored daily reflections format. And it's 1 page a day where we look at very specific things. Like, for example, can you stop seeking permission for what you want to do? Why are you asking permission? Etc. Taking time out. Dealing with the energy drains, which I know will probably resonate with a few people here from what I've seen in the chat. Why do we need to be right? Why do we need to improve? And so on. So it's a 28-day that ends with showing up as you are. And it's literally 1 page per day, which you can download for yourself, and you're invited to create your own 28-day course if you wish. It's brand new. I haven't even spell checked it properly yet, so if you see anything in there, please let me know. Yeah, there we go. So, how are we on time? Back to Claudia.
No, this one. Some Italian gestures. No more. I think we should leave a few minutes for people to just change room, maybe pass by some other useful
Exactly.
and grab a coffee. I don't know if you're going to move for a while to the coffee corner.
Yes, I will go to the coffee corner, although I also want to catch the next session. So I actually, yeah, I won't go to the coffee corner. I'll go straight to the next session because I really want to hear the sessions. You are welcome. Anyone is welcome to have coffee with me anytime they wish. And let me just very quickly, if I'm fast, I will share a link to the diary where we can have our own coffee in your own time zone anytime that works for you. Whoops. There we are. Huh. I think I've just, hopefully you're seeing that. So that's a link to a one-on-one coffee. Just we'll have to make our own coffee for the time being. So please do feel free to connect if any of those topics or if developing self-worth with others is of particular interest to you. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone's reading.